I'll kick off the introductions. I'm Devin with Bluehost. Obviously, I do field marketing management, which usually means that I'm the person that travels around to different WordCamps and gets to interact with the WordPress community. It's awesome. I also jumped in and went first because I am dealing with some allergies, some pretty crazy cedar fever. So I'm probably going to be muted and might turn off my camera on and off, depending on what's the status of blowing my nose I'm at, but I'll try to be in here and hang around for any other questions towards the end as well.
And where are you located, Devin?
I'm currently in Austin, Texas.
Very good.
Awesome. I'm Chris Miles. I'm a product manager over hosting at Bluehost, and I've been using WordPress for a very, very long time. I still do, and yeah, this I think I just figured out, by the way, Michelle, where we met. You were working at the Give WP booth, and I was working at the Bluehost booth.
I think that sounds right.
That's where we met, I think.
WordCamp US, probably?
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds right. Very good.
So, yeah. Well, cool. I think, Devin, you mentioned you wrote down the questions that were asked in the notes somewhere. So if there's any that by, halfway through or near the end of this that I didn't get to, let's revisit some of those. But most of what was asked about in here, I'll try to address as we go through this. Let's see if I can share my screen. All right. I think this is going to work. Share. It's asking for my computer password. Sorry, I haven't done. Or can you all see this? Do you see a screen that says Bluehost?
Yes.
Great. All right. So continuing on. Going through, there's a lot of things we could go through in terms of what cPanel does. But before we get into that, I wanted to, as a brief introduction to that, say that generally speaking, cPanel is kind of one place that you can manage a lot of different things that are related to the server where your website is probably hosted. So if you're using cPanel, really what this is, and I'll just log into an instance of cPanel really quickly to show you, is a place to manage kind of the server hosting technical side of things. So you'll see things in here of how to mess around in your files, how to mess around with databases, domains, email, if it so happens that your host does email for you as well, and other related things like that. So it's cPanel itself doesn't actually provide most of these services. cPanel just sort of aggregates them together, almost like a music festival of sorts of here's all the different things that you can see, but individual pieces are not usually created by cPanel. So, if companies are able to create their own, oftentimes they're able to do that simply because what cPanel is providing is kind of the collection and arrangement and of all of those things, but not the things themselves usually. Like cPanel didn't create FTP, which is a way to manage files. It didn't create its own file manager or really most of these tools in here, which is why companies like SiteGround are able to get away with making their own, is because all of the pieces that make this up, or at least most of them, weren't even made by cPanel. It's the collection and arrangement of them that cPanel was able to do. So some companies are able to figure out how to do that themselves without terribly interrupting their customers too badly. So
kind of like how
there's a lot we could cover.
It's kind of like how WordPress has plugins and themes that aren't part of WordPress, but kind of collect them all together.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of things in here that we could cover, but just trying to keep it to a few basics. What I thought would make sense is if we cover DNS, which is how you can point domains to a hosting provider, and a little bit about that, a little bit about some of the more common ways that people use cPanel, particularly when it comes to files and email. And we're just going to scratch the surface of some of these things. And hopefully by the end of this, you might have some exposure to things that you might want to look into more if it's interesting, or you might have some questions for, okay, now I know what to ask when I call up my hosting provider and say, I need help with this. But we won't really have time to go super deep into any of these topics probably, but at any point, feel free to ask questions.
Excuse me, I have a question about the DNS. This assumes either that you're going to discuss the line of demarcation there between actual domain server. I use Google. I don't keep my domain name at my hosting provider, and the things that's an area that I'd like to know more about or become more familiar with. There's stuff at the domain server and stuff at the hosting provider that needs to mash together in order to get it all to work right, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that, we should probably start with to introduce everyone is there's a lot of different ways you could look at it. But one way that I think makes sense to me is you could think of it as, where did you buy the domain name? And then where is your site hosted? Sometimes that's the same place, because a lot of the companies that sell domains also sell hosting, and a lot of companies that sell hosting also sell domains. So it's not at all uncommon for those two to be exactly the same. And sometimes it's even easier to set it up that way. There's advantages and disadvantages, but it's also really, really common for people to have them in different places, where I bought my domain over here at domain.com, but I'm hosting it over here at HostGator or some other combination. These are just companies that I happen to choose, but there's thousands of companies, right? But the idea being that it's not always in the same place. So it sounds like in your case, you bought your domain name at Google. You might be using Google for hosting, but you might be using somewhere else. So it's possible for those two things to be separated. And the way that those two things can be properly connected is through something called DNS, domain name system. Sometimes DNS refers to domain name server specifically, but usually domain name system. And the only reason why that's important is you can think of it as the way that you point your domain name to a hosting provider. So for this example, let's pretend that I bought my domain name from domain.com, and the place where my website is actually held and hosted, and who I'm paying every month for hosting, that's HostGator. Let's just imagine in this example. So if we're doing that, I would be pointing my domain from domain.com to HostGator. And the way I would do that is using DNS. So let's go through this. There's two ways you can point a domain name. And the distinction here is kind of important. And I'm going to simplify a little bit the types of ways you can point a domain name into two categories and explain the differences a little bit. But when you're pointing a domain name, there's a lot of records online that are public that say where a domain name is supposed to be pointed. That way, anyone on the internet can look up where a domain name is pointed. That's how it works. So if I want to go to, example.com, it needs to be available. The information of where this website is hosted has to be public, so that anyone can in their browser type this in, and your computer or your internet service provider or whatever can look up, okay, what server do I need to connect to so that I can pull up this website? And the way it does that series of records, and there's lots of records online, is DNS. So two main types of records that we're going to be talking about today. And because although there's a lot we could cover with DNS, the use case that we're going to be focusing on here is I bought my domain name in one place, and I'm using it in another place. If you bought them and you're using them in the same place, chances are it's already set up for you and you don't have to do anything. But if you bought them in different places, there's a little bit of setup. So let's talk through some of that. So if you're going to point this over, let's start with name servers. So if you think of collections of domains as all of the records in the world for all of the domains, if you imagine that they're all held in hundreds of phone books, everyone here knows what phone book is, right? So if you imagine that there's just hundreds of phone books out there, but for the internet, and they have just collections and collections of numbers, because the way that a computer identifies a server isn't the same way that people do. People use domain names. They have letters in them. They're memorable, things like example.com. But a computer actually needs an IP address. So in the case of like example.com, that IP address is 93.184.216.34. It's not very memorable. And so what DNS does is it gives you a way to translate the domain name, which is memorable, example.com or, chrisdavidmiles.com or bluehost.com, whatever that is, translates it to that number, and the number is the server, right, where the site is hosted. So these phone books for the internet, they're not really phone books, but you can imagine that name servers are like phone books, hold records of where all of these sites are hosted. So you can ask a name server, where can I find example.com, right? And there's a whole complicated infrastructure in place for your internet service provider so that it knows exactly what phone book to look at. But for this, let's just think that there's only one for a minute. You ask in that phone book, where is my website? Miles.com or whatever. And you'll get a response back that says, here is the address, the numeric address of that site, similar to looking up a phone number, right? So when you're pointing your domain, going back to this, you bought your domain from one company, it's hosted in another place. So when you point that, there's two ways you can do that. The first way is to find out what are the name servers of my hosting provider, because a lot of hosting providers will maintain their own name servers, phone books. And if you say, okay, if I'm just going to point my domain name, if I just put it in their phone book, I won't have to worry about what the actual number is. It just then becomes their problem. So for example, Bluehost has two main name servers that it uses, ns1.bluehost.com and ns2.bluehost.com. Now, if somebody points their domain name to those name servers, then it becomes in Bluehost is then in charge of where that site is pointed, right? So when you buy a domain name, one of the settings that will always be available is what name servers should I point this website to, right? And what that's doing is, what phone book should your website be in, right? And there's different ways you can set that up. So if it's something, one of those really common companies that hosts a lot of sites, you can oftentimes just call them up and ask, hey, what name servers should I be using if I want to host my site with you? And if you do that, it'll be pointing the entire domain over to that hosting provider, and then it's on that hosting provider to set up the rest. So it's usually the easiest way to do it is just to say, okay, I'm using, in this example we said HostGator. I'm using HostGator, so I'm going to point it at the HostGator phone book, and then it'll be on HostGator to figure out the rest. Now, there are some situations where, for whatever reason, that's not possible to do, or you might want to just directly manage the listing yourself, because sometimes people have a more complicated setup where sometimes your email is in a different place than your website. And if that's the case, sometimes you have to set it up in a little bit more complicated of a way. Or sometimes you have a certain setup where it's a requirement that you have to use a certain phone book for some reason. And some security products set that up. So because of that, you might be in a situation where, okay, I can't just point it at their phone book and have it be their problem. I have to do the listing myself, right? Point an individual record. So both of those things are possible. One is, let's point all the records for this domain. The other is, I'm going to point an individual record for the site, right? So pointing name servers is what says which phone book it's going to use. Pointing an individual record is, I know which server this is going to be on. I know the address of that server, and I'm going to use that, right? If you're not sure which one to use, I would recommend the easier method, just using name servers, and call up your hosting provider and ask them to help you, and they will, usually. So when you're deciding, I've got my domain over here with Google, but my website is over here, the two ways you can decide to point that are point the whole domain and say, okay, I'm going to use the phone book of this company, or you can point an individual record and manage that record yourself. Questions about this before we move on? What questions do people have?
Those records, now, are you talking about the A record and the C record?
Yes. So an A record is a record for the domain name itself for an IP version 4 IP, right? So that's maintaining an individual record yourself. Like, here's the phone number. It's in the phone book. I'm just going to manage that listing myself, right? So that's pointing an individual A record or IPv6 record, or a CNAME you mentioned is another possibility. So that's these on the right. But usually it's easier to just use the name servers of whoever your host is and let them worry about the rest.
I agree with that 100%. Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. Any other questions about this before we move on? And by the way, if you're looking at this and saying, oh my gosh, this is a lot of information, I have no idea what this kid is talking about, it's okay. All you need to know is your domain name, where you bought your domain, and where you hosted their domain. They don't have to be in the same place. And if they're not in the same place, that's okay. Your hosting provider will help you set that up correctly. It's a very, very common thing for hosting providers to do. Yeah.
I have a question about this. So if you're setting this up and working with a vendor and you're, pointing all this stuff, is it instantaneous or does it take a couple of days to populate? What kind of time frames are we talking about here?
That is a really good question. It is not instantaneous. Depending on what has been changed, it can take anywhere from minutes to days. And the reason for that is the infrastructure of it is set up in such a way that everyone saves their own copy, and everyone along the chain. So if your computer has been to a site before, sometimes it won't look up where it's hosted. It will just remember. And if your router has been to a site before, sometimes it won't look it up. And if your internet service provider has already looked up that website and knows where it's hosted in the last 8 hours, it probably won't look it up again. It'll just use what it has. And every step of the way, all the way to the server, there's a lot of network hops in between. It will, if it already knows the answer, we'll just use that, which is great because what that means is you don't have to look it up every time, and it's much, much faster that way. The downside is if it ever changes, it takes a while for everyone to notice that it changes because they don't look it up every time. They say, oh, no, I already know the answer. I've been here before, and they'll point at the old location. And it could take them anywhere from minutes to days to notice, oh, it's actually changed. I should update my records. There are ways to make that faster, but it depends on your setup. But yeah, that's a really good question. Depending on what you're changing, it can take minutes or days or anything in between. Any other questions? If we have a minute or two, we can go through some quick examples of sites, and we can show where they're hosted to kind of give an example of how this works in the real world. If you guys want, we could do that.
Go for it.
Does anyone have a website they want to use? I've got a couple example sites I can use, but does anybody have a website that they don't mind us looking up where it's hosted?
You can use wpcoffeetalk.com if you'd like.
wpcoffeetalk.com?
You got
All
it.
right. I spelled it wrong.
I was going to say, wait, what happened to my site?
Coffee Talk. Is this it?
It is.
So let's look first at where the domain was purchased. So to do that, I'm looking at a certain type of record that tells us that. It looks like this domain is registered with GoDaddy. So going back with
Correct.
this example, where did I buy the domain? Apparently GoDaddy is what this record shows. And then where is it hosted? Well, the name servers are something called Sentry.io. So that means the phone book for this site is, this one actually has 4 different listings for what name servers. I've nicknamed it phone book, but in real life it's name servers. What name servers should we use? So that means that these name servers are the ones that computers and everything else should look for when trying to find out where this site is really hosted. So this isn't where the site is hosted. This is where to find the record of where the site is hosted. And by the way, when you do this, when you go to, when your browser just goes to the website, it all just happens in the background, right? In order to go to WP Coffee Talk, I didn't have to look anything up. My browser and my computer knew how to do all of that. But if we were doing it manually as humans, here's how it would work. So there's 4 places where these records are held. So let's use that and do a DNS lookup of that. So if and I'll have to resize my window for this to work. Yeah. So before, if we say, hey, where are the records for this site? Well, there's 4 places where they're at. And if we use those 4 places and then say, what's the IP address of this site? Looks like it has an IPv4 address. Here is the address here. So what this means is the site is hosted on something called UpCloud, it appears to be. And this is the IP address. So there's 2 ways you could set this up. But in this example here, where we were talking about phone book, so the phone book in this example is Sentry.io. There's 4 phone books here, 4 name servers, and the listing where it actually says is this here, and it says this is the answer. Which let's double check and see if we were right. I'll ask my browser to tell me, hey, what's the address of this site? 209.151. 209.151. Yeah, so it looks like this is where this site is hosted. Now, don't worry, you're probably never going to have to look this up manually. The only reason I'm showing you this is to demonstrate what I mean, which is if you wanted to change where this site was hosted, there's 2 ways you could do it. You could change this record individually. If you're like, no, I know exactly where it is, the server isn't going to change, I only want to change this one record, you could change this one record. And you would do that here, where those records are held. So you would change the record inside the phone book, right? Now, if you wanted to point the entire domain name somewhere else and you didn't want to have to worry about what number do I put in here, then you would just pick the phone book of your hosting provider. If you wanted to say, this domain name, it's now with Kinsta, hosting provider that I like. It's now with Kinsta. I'm going to use Kinsta's name servers, Kinsta's phone book, and I won't have to worry about what IP address to use. Right? So that's just an example. You don't have to worry about how to look this up, but just, does this all kind of make sense? Of like, you can point a domain to a particular phone book, or you can manage the listing yourself, is the concept here. So you don't have to worry about the specifics of how to do it, because every single hosting provider and every single domain name registrar lets you change it a little differently. But I could show you one as an example if you'd like. Would that be helpful?
Sure.
All right. Let's use Devin Sears one. Here's what it looks like at Bluehost. But it'll look a little different everywhere else that you go. All right, manage. This is devinsears.com. So if I wanted to point my domain name somewhere else, you'll say, since this domain name was bought through Bluehost, I can change the name servers to something completely different if I wanted to. And I would just do that in here by saying, okay, let's say it's HostMonster. I happen to know that off the top of my head. ns2.hostmonster.com. I'm not really going to click save because that I think would break his site, but yeah.
He'd hate that.
And email, but yeah, so that's how you do that. And so in other words, here are the two phone books to use, and since it's Bluehost that it's pointed to, both things, both of the what phone book should I use and what's the listing are both in the same place, because the domain name was purchased by Bluehost and it's hosted by Bluehost. So here's the record itself, the individual record, and here's the setting that lets me change it. And it looks a little different from everyone, but if you're not sure where it is, just call up your hosting provider and explain to them, I bought my domain name over here, can you help me point it? And any of them should be able to help you with that. Cool, that's probably enough on this. That maybe it was too long, but that's DNS. Quick overview, your domain and your hosting don't have to be in the same place. If they are in the same place, that's really easy because then you never have to worry about it. But if they aren't in the same place, that's okay, because you can change where it's pointed and your hosting provider can help you do that. Let's move on. File management, that's another really common, and by the way, the reason why we're talking about this at all is cPanel is oftentimes used for changing those kinds of records. So changing records in the phone book is one of the things that cPanel knows how to do. At Bluehost, we don't actually use cPanel for that. We have our own that's about 11 times faster, but a lot of people do use cPanel for that. So file management is another thing we could go over, which is another thing that is really common for people to want to use cPanel for. So has anyone had to mess around with their files inside their website?
Oh, yeah.
If you don't mind, could you tell me what the situation was, like what you were changing and why? Do you remember?
I was out of space on my account, and well,
I trying to figure out what to delete or what to move.
Yeah, right. I had some backup files. Come to find out that my backup plugins weren't reporting as part of their own. So you know, time wounds all heals. As time goes by, I made changes. I learned new things and forgot about them, and next thing you know, I was in trouble. So
yeah. Well, yeah, that's a really common reason. Another thing that's really common is sometimes people want to, I'll use this one as an example. Sometimes people want to change things in a particular configuration file. A common one is wp-config.
Or htaccess.
htaccess is another really common one. If you're using specifically the Apache web server, you might want to put redirects in here where you say redirect one URL to another URL. you can put that in here in an htaccess file. So editing a config file, or looking around to see what's taking up so much space. Another common reason is sometimes you want to upload a custom theme or a custom plugin, and doing that through WordPress for whatever reason isn't working the way that you wanted. So those are some of the more common reasons that I've seen people need to mess around with their files. So we can talk through some of the ways to do that.
And Chris, sometimes if you update a plugin and it breaks your site, you would go here and you can rename the folder. The plugins.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Perfect.
Really perfect place to do that. Yeah.
Perfect.
Right.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So one of the things I would recommend is for everyone to be on the latest version of WordPress. In the last few versions, we made it so that if a particular plugin is breaking your site, more often than not, WordPress knows how to recover from that and can help you. But sometimes even WordPress can't recover from that, and you have to manually figure it out. And when that happens, yeah, it is sometimes useful to be able to go into the plugins folder and say, oh, I'll pick on my own plugin because this is actually a plugin I wrote. Oh, this plugin is breaking my site, so why don't I either rename it or delete it or whatever. But yeah, so that's a common thing you can do. Another thing you can do is if themes are going wrong, you can either remove the active theme and install a default one to try and fix your site. Some hosts will give you a way to do that doesn't require messing around with files yourself, but not all of them do, which if not, then you'll find yourself in here.
The method I've used to troubleshoot a potentially broken plugin is to rename my plugins directory or folder, and create another one, and then run the site, and then move plugins back into from the renamed folder to the new folder, move plugins in one at a time to see where along the line something breaks.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to do it, because sometimes normally you'd be in here in your plugins folder, but if somehow something breaks in your plugins and you can't get into that, let me just break something on this site really quick. This is just a test site. No one's going to be sad when this breaks.
You're good when you can purposely break a site. I only ever do it accidentally.
Yeah. Let's see. Page. Yeah. I'm just going to edit this really quickly. 2FA. Give me just a second.
So while you're doing that, I'm going to jump in here.
Go ahead.
When I first got involved with WordPress, I had Michelle and Mike and whatnot all talking about FTP and this and FTP and that and all this other stuff. And I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago when I got started, I pressed a button and WordPress was installed on my host. And then I went and built my system. And so in 5 years, I have never looked at yes, I have looked at it, but I've never done a thing with it. Is this common, or is this more for the super users?
If you've never ever had to mess with FTP, then that's a good thing, because it means that nothing went wrong. It's sort of like you never had to look under the hood of your car. Usually the only times you're having to mess around with files manually is because something else isn't working, and you have to manually figure out, okay, what am I going to do? The regular way isn't working. So I just broke one of my plugins on my site, and WordPress was able to recover from it, and it said, hey, there's been a critical error on your website. And if I go to WP admin for this site, it'll tell me, hey, there's been a critical error for your site. Check your email for instructions. And WordPress just sent me an email that said, hey, if you click on this link, we'll load up your site and turn off the plugin that we think is causing the problem. And then, you can at least get into your site, and then there you go. Your stuff is good. That being said, WordPress can't always figure out exactly what's wrong, and sometimes things can break in ways that you end up still having to manually do this. Hopefully it never happens though. But yeah, so that's one of the things you can do is if something's broken, here, let me break it again. If something's broken, one of the things you can do is you can just go into your, folder and say, let's see, plugins, find the plugin you think is the problem, or if you're not sure, you can just rename the whole folder, plugins_old. I'm just going to rename that. And then, okay, that would turn off all of the plugins.
Just a caution on taking that approach. When I moved my security plugin out of operation, essentially, that exposed a lot of things on my site that normally that security plugin would take care of. So,
right.
That's
so that can be a risk.
Yes.
Sure. So it's one of the things you'll have to consider is that, like, hey, if turning off all the plugins, because when you rename a folder, the plugins folder, you're turning off all the plugins. You're not turning off one of them. You're turning them all off. So if one of those plugins is so mission critical that it's better your site stay broken than that plugin be off while you figure it out, this method probably isn't best, and
Right.
You'll have to figure out another way to do it, and there's lots of ways you can do it.
Right.
But this is what happens, which is WordPress will say, hey, all of these plugins that were installed, I don't see them anymore. And then if you move your folder back, and you can rename. And I'm going to go back here. Then here they all are in the list again, but they're all turned off, right? So that is one way you can do it. It's kind of a last resort, but it is something you can do. What I would recommend for the most part, if you're going to be changing something, is see what you can do that is kind of the least amount of work. And so if there's a way you can add a plugin just using WordPress, that's what I would recommend. WordPress has built into it a way to upload plugins, third-party plugins. You can just go to plugins, add new, upload. And if that doesn't work, then you can try something else. But like for the most part, try to use like a very WordPressy way to do what you're doing, because the further outside that you go, the more hassle you're going to find. So if you can do it in a browser, try that. So if your host has a file manager that works in a browser, try that. If that isn't working, then venture out into something like FTP or SSH or something a little bit more manual that way. Because while FTP and SSH and rsync and some of those things can move files for you, if you only need to do this once or twice, really just go with whatever the easiest way is, in my opinion.
Right, and when you don't use the normal WordPress methods, then the database isn't updated.
Right, like if you're uploading like media, like pictures or video or something like that, if you use WordPress to do that, then it's in your WordPress database, or at least a record of it is in your WordPress database, so it's easier to put it into posts. If you do it separately, then there's other plugins that you'll probably have to install to synchronize and make sure that those get imported, or they might just not get imported, and then you'll just have to manually keep track of where those links are, which is a bit of work. So if you can figure out a way to do it in WP admin, that might be better. There are ways, for example, to even do file management in WP admin. You have to be careful because if you're using WP admin to change WordPress, there's a chance you could break your site. And if the tool that you're using to work on your site is WordPress, then you're in a tough spot because, well, the thing that I would use to fix this is the thing that's not working, you know? So in those cases, you might have to venture out. But like if it's a really small, simple change that you're confident in, there are plugins that you can use for file management. One that, let's see, one that I've used before for a file manager is, if I can find it, FileStir. It's not as popular, but it's, in terms of like the code and how it works, I like this one because you can lock down who has access to what. And you can say, you know, only, yeah, here's file manager settings. Only let, you know, editors or certain people, only let admins have access, and it lets you change a few things which might be useful. There's other ways that you can lock it down to make it a little more secure. The only thing that I would caution is anytime you're adding a plugin like File Manager or like something to manage your database, depending on the level of risk of your site, it might be a good idea to only have those plugins installed and activated while you're using them and then removing them after the fact. Like if, for example, you've got a site with really sensitive information, probably only use those plugins, have those plugins there while you're using them and then remove them after the fact, just because it's a little bit less risk in case there's ever a vulnerability in those files, or in those plugins, I should say. But yeah, so in terms of messing around with your files, that is one way to do it. But if there's a tool that you can use that makes it so you don't have to edit the file manually, that's probably going to be better. So let's say you need to add redirects to your site. You can do that by editing the htaccess file. If there's a tool that will do it for you, and that tool does just as good of a job, probably use the tool rather than, you know, and unless it's a site that has very little traffic, or you know, one that you're just working on and you don't mind. Because if I set up a redirect here, like for example, cPanel has a way to add redirects.
Why do I want to redirect?
Well, let's say you move a page from one spot to another. It used to be contact me, and now it's just /contact or whatever. You can say, okay, anyone that goes to this old URL, actually go to this new URL. I'm currently in the process of migrating a site from one domain to another. In which case, hey, if you ever get an old URL, now I can map that to a new URL at a new domain. So it's not something you'd have to do every day, but if you do have to do it, if you can find a tool that will do it for you, you'll probably find that to be a better experience than trying to manually edit the file.
By tool, you're referring to a plugin, right?
There are plugins that can do that. That is a really good approach, I think. There's also a lot of times hosting providers have that built in. So like cPanel has a way to do that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. But there's also ways to do it with WordPress plugins, right? So there's a number of ways that can happen. So redirects are a common one. If you need to change something in WP config, you know, be really careful because typos there can break your site. But like, in any case, if there's a way you can avoid editing files directly, particularly config files, see if you can avoid it. is my personal advice. Any more questions about file management? How to get to files? We could a little bit talk about how to find files in the file structure if we have time. Any more questions about this?
It is possible also through file. Well, I don't know if it's through file management, but you could actually lock out files from the cPanel too, so people don't have access from the outside to your website to certain pages and things like that. And that's always a little more complex. I've also used the file manager to clean up hacked sites to find all of those nasty inserted files that needed to be deleted and replaced, things like the header files and things that have been corrupted, and used file manager for that too. That was a fun night.
Yeah, that can be kind of a mess. Sometimes if your site gets hacked, they'll modify WordPress core, they'll modify plugins, and they'll just add files that aren't supposed to be there. And so you'll have to go in and try and delete those or find a service that does that. Sometimes there's plugins that can help with that a little bit. One that I think works pretty well is Securi. Not everyone likes it. I do. But one of the things it can do is it can look at the files of your site and say, do these files match the official WordPress core files, or have they been modified? And when you do that, it can look through your files and say, hey, is there anything in here that shouldn't be? And it's pretty useful. And there's a free version that can do that. It looks like in this one, it says all the core files are correct, which makes sense. But if I do that, let's see. It might not include that because that's yeah, there we go. I just modified one of my files and it says, hey, look, your WordPress core has been modified a little bit. Do you want to revert it? Do you want to, and what I did was just harmless, but that's what that does. So that can help in that situation. Sometimes a hack is so comprehensive that something automated like a plugin can't help, or sometimes a hack is so bad that you have to fix it before plugins can really do their job. But yeah. Any other questions, comments about that? Cool. One of the things that might come up, depending on if you have more than one site, is the question of how do you find your files? Now, if you're using a plugin, then that's probably going to be pretty easy because the site will already be able to figure out on its own, hey, here are all the files for this site. But sometimes, but if you're using something else, if you're using a tool that shows you all of them, then you might have to figure that out on your own. And so, yeah, in that case, depending on your setup, you might have to ask your hosting provider for help and saying, can you help me find the folder where this particular website is hosted? Right? And some hosts make that available inside their control panel. Some you have to call them and ask, but sometimes you can figure that out. Another thing that you might find is depending on your setup, like if you're using cPanel, for example, cPanel has this habit of they'll have what they call a primary domain and then add-on domains. That's a concept that cPanel invented. But basically, in order to have more than one site on one server, their solution was to make it so that the files of one site are inside the files of another site. And just because it's easier to set up that way. And so, yeah, you might find that, oh, in order to go here, I've got to figure out, where something is and navigate through several things to find where you're at. And you might need some help there. One of the reasons why sometimes it's easier to use a file manager plugin is you don't have to know what folder to do because the plugin will figure that out for you because it already knows. Now, plugins aren't always going to work. Depending on what you're doing, like if you're troubleshooting a broken site and you can't install a new plugin, well, then that's not going to help you. But yeah. So one of the things you'll have to think about when you do this is, am I in the right folder, and where is this hosted? If you're using a file manager, it's usually something that you can figure out by clicking around. If you're using FTP, it can be a lot harder. If you're not familiar with FTP, FTP is another way to browse files that doesn't use your browser. It uses another kind of program. FTP is good for moving a lot of data and a lot of files over a period of time. It's not very user-friendly though. So you kind of only use it if you have to. So if you're, for whatever reason, you have to use FTP, then that problem would be even harder of, now I have to figure out what folder this is in, and I don't have a necessarily as pretty an interface to kind of guide me through this process or limit what I have access to just a few places. So it's something to think through, is if at all possible, using a file manager plugin can be better. But yeah, it just depends on what you need. Any questions about that before we keep going?
I think we're good.
Cool. By the way, how are we doing on time?
We're good. We have until 8:30 for this meetup, so.
Okay. So let's continue into domain branded email. So lots of times, if what you're setting up is a business or something like a business, it's not uncommon for people to set up email addresses that use a domain name rather than using like an @gmail.com. So I don't know if WP Coffee Talk does this, but like a lot of sites will have
Michelle at wpcoffeetalk.com.
Okay, there you go. So it's one of the things that is pretty common to be able to do is branded email. Google Apps is one way to set that up. You can basically use like Gmail and Google Docs and all of those things, but the version of it that's intended for businesses, and you can do it at whatever domain name you own, which is kind of nice, and it makes collaboration easy. There's also Office 365, which is the Microsoft version of that. But some hosting providers give you kind of a cheap way to do it yourself. cPanel, one of the things that some people who use cPanel do sometimes is email as well, where you can actually use cPanel to create email accounts and set up things like that. Now, there's usually the only advantage, I would say, in putting your email on the same server as your website is that depending on the setup, it might be cheaper to do it that way, where you might find that depending on your hosting provider, it might be possible to set up branded email addresses at no additional cost, right? And if that's the case, it might be a good option depending on what limitations exist. If you need something a little bit more robust than what cPanel or other kind of single server setups exist, sometimes it's better to use a professional email host separate than a professional web host. So you can have your email hosted by Google or Microsoft and your website hosted by any number of places. And depending on what you have, that might be better or worse. It just depends. What is the cost difference? Does the cheap version fulfill all your needs? If it does, then by all means use it. But yeah, so if you set up email on the server, one of the things you'll then have to probably figure out is how much space is this going to take up? And depending on who your hosting provider is, that may or may not be a concern. Some don't care about storage very much at all. Some have very strict limits. So you'll if you're using your web host for email hosting, that is one thing you'll have to think about, is that if you're doing a lot of emailing, there's a lot of correspondence, sending back and forth large attachments, you could end up using some storage that, if you're limited on storage, you could end up using a lot for your email without even realizing it. So yeah, setting up email accounts is pretty easy within cPanel. You just you go through the process of clicking through and defining, hey, what domain name do we want to use, what username, what's the password, that sort of thing. It'll look different at most hosting providers provide like a theme for this. This is the default one. This is just a vanilla install of cPanel. But yeah, a lot of email providers or hosting providers will change how this looks just a little bit. But yeah, you can set up email addresses here. And then this is where you'll have to probably talk with your hosting provider specifically if you want your website to send emails correctly. And so one of the things that's really important to test, because most people sort of take it for granted, is does your website send emails correctly? Because if, let me log out of this site, and this is just a test site, but if I go to log in to this test site and I say lost your password, well, WordPress is what's going to be sending this email. Please check your username or email address. If I try to reset my password here, that's going to be sent by WordPress, which means the server or servers that run your website need a way to send email. Sometimes that's set up automatically in the background and you never have to worry about it, but sometimes it's not. So if you've never done a password reset on your website, it's probably worth it to write down as a personal note to test that out and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, see if you can fix it before you need to reset your password. But yeah, different hosting providers all have very, very different setups when it comes to how should a website server send email. Some will do it so that that same server is the server that sends the email. cPanel likes to do it that way. Some have a different network of servers that will send email and a different network of servers that will do website, and they separate them. And there's reasons why that separation makes sense in terms of like making sure your email is delivered. But yeah, because of those differences, and there's a million different ways to set it up, each one is a little different depending on which hosting provider you do. So probably a good starting point is if you want your website to be able to send emails like password reset emails or a contact form or something like that, is just test it and see if it works. And if it does, fantastic. You're most of or all of the way there. If it doesn't, there's a couple of things you should probably check. So one of the things you can do, and let me log in, and this is a test site, so I'm gonna just log in. But one of the things you can test is in your settings, make sure this email address, administration email address, make sure this is set to something like correct and good, because it might be set to the wrong thing. And if it is, well, maybe that's why you're not getting the right email. Another thing to check is in your profile here at the top. Click edit my profile. You can see if the email address there is the right one. And so, yeah, there's, it's a good idea to have start by checking those. If both of those are correct, then what you might do is call up your hosting provider and say, hey, what do you recommend in terms of, sending email? Because some won't let you do it, or will, but there's certain rules. So what you might find is WordPress is written in a programming language called PHP, and it uses primarily PHP to send emails. But what you might find is, for whatever reason, some hosting providers make it so that that is no longer supported, or it's disabled. And so one of the things you can do is there's actually plugins that will make it so that rather than using this your web server for email, it can use a different server, right? So you can do, for example, you can install plugins that will make it so that it uses Amazon Simple email protocol. So SES is a really common thing for, hey, I've got a lot of automated messages that I need to send securely and efficiently. How can I do that? For things like password resets, some people will use a service like Amazon SES. So there are plugins that will let you use Amazon SES, for example. I'm just naming that as as an example. There's a lot. Some will let you use Gmail. Some hosting providers actually prefer that you use them for sending email on a site, because what they might find is that if it's permitted to allow another server to do the sending, they might have different outbound spam rules that might get your web server reported for spam, even though your web server isn't what's sending emails. So there's a lot of reasons. My point there is that there's a lot of reasons why it might be set up differently, and you might have to call your hosting provider and say, hey, this isn't working. How can I set this up right? And it's probably a common thing for them to help people set that up properly. At Bluehost, it just sort of just works out of the box. At a lot of really like WordPress hosting companies, WordPress-centric hosting companies, they make sure that that works out of the box. But depending on who you have, there might be an extra step or two. They might say, oh, you need this extra plugin here or there. You need to change the setting here. But yeah, if you're setting up a contact form, that's the same process of you'll need to make sure that everything on the hosting side permits it, and that if it does, it's set up properly. And sometimes that requires an extra plugin or two, but the setups are all so different, you'll probably need to ask your host, how do I get this to work? And a lot of times they'll actually publish articles. Like I'm gonna take a guess. WordPress email setup GoDaddy. I'm just gonna take a guess that there we go.
Yep.
Now, I didn't look ahead of time, but here's an article published by GoDaddy on here's how to set this up. And they recommend you use a specific plugin that they created. And it'll be a little different for different hosting providers. But yeah, here's somebody on WordPress.org asking a question, hey, I'm using GoDaddy. How does, do I need to use this? Do I need to use that? But yeah, so you can set it up in different ways. And a lot of times hosts will publish articles on the internet that describe how to set it up if you have to do anything special.
Chris,
any questions about this?
Yeah, so Trisha had a question. She says with one of her clients, the admin email is wrong, and she's tried to change it several times. It doesn't seem to send the email to her such that she can confirm it. She hadn't thought about that being a channel thing before. She is asking if you have any advice and how to reset an admin email if you aren't getting the email to confirm.
I would start with seeing if it's a problem with, whenever I'm troubleshooting, I try to narrow down what it can be by testing the smallest piece I can, and then more and more and more. And in my experience, the easiest way to test just sending email is if you have a user or an account or whatever, maybe create an extra user on that site if you can, with a particular email address that you do have access to, and then see if you can do a password reset just with the regular log into WordPress, click lost your password, see if it sends that email. And if it doesn't, then you've narrowed it down to, okay, it is a problem with my website's ability to send email. And at that point is when, depending on your hosting provider, you can start doing a little bit of digging. And I usually just jump straight to, let me call them up, or open up a chat or whatever. But if you want to do a little digging on your own, which is also an option, sometimes you can just Google that and say, HostGator, WordPress not sending emails. And from there, you'll be able to, find some help articles that HostGator has published. I'm just using them as an example. Are you able to receive emails but not send? How do I fix this? Sometimes people will, publish videos on YouTube on how to do it, and what specific settings. And if you're having a problem still, or the answer isn't immediately obvious, hopefully you've got a hosting provider or a web admin that can help you to kind of troubleshoot it further. But what I would start in is try to narrow it down to, is this a problem with the site, or is this a problem with my ability to send an email from the site on this hosting provider? In my experience, the easiest way to do that is just a really simple password reset. Because if this works, but other stuff doesn't, well, then you can, okay, maybe the website is the problem. But if this doesn't work, then probably your ability to send email from the site is the problem, and then kind of dive into that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question?
So here's the follow-up to that question, and I'm not asking you to show us how to do it because I think it's complex, but can you change the admin email through a cPanel using the PHPMyAdmin, for example?
You can, but you also don't have to.
Right.
I can show you how to do it in WordPress. So is this the one you're looking to change, the administration email?
I believe so. I don't know if Trisha's still here or if she's muted because her kids tend to practice
Okay.
violin this time of day too, but I believe that's what she's talking about. Yes.
Yeah. So if I go ahead, Trisha.
Yeah, that's the email that I'm trying to change. I've been able to, like, it shows up after I tried to change it. It shows up down there, asking if that's the one you want to change it to and saying to watch for the email. But then I never received that email. So I'm trying it right now to set up a new user to see if I can do it that way.
Okay. Yeah. See if you can. That's where I would start, is create a new user with that email address and see if you can do a password reset. And if you can't, then even if you were able to change it with like PHPMyAdmin or something, that wouldn't really help you, because if you can't receive emails at that address from your site, well, then that's still a problem, right?
Right.
But if you're just trying to get around, sometimes I've seen a problem where somehow they, let's see. But if you are able to, and for whatever reason you're just not getting that email, or you're having trouble with this interface, one of the things you can do is, if you try to change it here, what WordPress will do is say, hey, there's a pending change.
Yep,
right?
I get that message. Yep.
Right, and that's what you get. There's a way around that, and that's up at the top where it says options-general.php.
Mm-hmm.
Change the URL so there's just options.php. And you'll find a secret page in WordPress that many people don't know about.
This is the one that's in my talk about the hidden secrets of WordPress.
Yes.
I tell
Yeah.
people this
There's a
is with
secret
great
menu in here.
great
this secret,
responsibility.
then do a Control F to find it on the page, and you'll look for admin_email, and this one will let you change it without asking for if it's right or wrong and without confirmation. The only thing to be careful with here is this will let you set it to the wrong thing or anything.
Okay.
So this is changing it directly. And then you don't have to go into PHPMyAdmin and worry about editing serialized data. You can just
Awesome.
do it
That's
here.
so helpful because I know that like this person is retiring actually in the next 2 months. But since I received this website to take care of, I've been taking care of it for 2 years. It's never let me update the email, and the host that she's with is just I don't get along with them. Let's just put it that way. So they're just frustrating. They kept sending me in circles. So thank you.
Yeah. So this will help you do that, but you'll still need to solve the problem of it needs to be able to send you emails. Because if you change this to the right thing and then it still can't send you emails, you're still stuck.
Yeah. Yeah, but like
yeah.
I said, she's retiring in the end of February and wants me to take her whole site down. So hopefully I don't have to worry about it after that.
Fair enough.
But it's just been bugging me for so long. When I saw you do that, I had to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely how you can do that, is just do it that way. You
I
can
forgot
also do it through command line or through editing the database directly. There's a lot of ways, but that's kind of a easy hidden way to do it. Any other questions?
That was the only one in the chat.
Cool. So in terms of...
It's 6 o'clock.
Oh, that was my computer. Yeah, so in terms of email, there's a lot of things that you might find when troubleshooting is what you're trying to do. But what I would recommend is two main things. The first is when you're trying to troubleshoot, and this applies to everything, not just email, but when you're trying to troubleshoot, try to narrow what you're looking at as much as you can, to where if you can find a way to test just one little piece of something, and then at one step at a time, test every little piece, it'll be a lot easier than this whole thing doesn't work and I don't know where. Because then you can drill in on, okay, well, it's not a problem with the site, it's a problem with my server isn't sending the email. Why is that the case? And you can keep going. So like, one of the things that was mentioned, I don't remember who, somebody on this call mentioned that they had a problem with Apache Spam Assassin or Spam Comp or something like that.
Oh, I was talking about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that can sometimes be a little bit obnoxious when your email and your website are on the same server, is when the service that's sending email is particularly optimized for what it is. Like for example, Amazon SES is particularly optimized for sending email. And your web server is probably particularly optimized for being a web server. That's one of the problems you'll run into, is that decisions about things like spam filters, things like how it's set up and how it's, how you're supposed to make this work, are all going to be based on what are the most common use cases, which are, it's a web server. It's there to make a website work. And so sometimes when you're using things like cPanel for email, one of the downsides sometimes can be that it's set up primarily to do a good job at showing your website. And if there's ever a situation where your hosting provider has to make a choice between, well, do we make it good at being a web server or do we make it good at being email? They're probably going to choose one or the other. And usually in the case of web hosting, they're going to choose web hosting. So if you're using a third-party service, for actually sending the email, oftentimes you'll have a lot less problems with things like deliverability. So sometimes, depending on what you're using, you might actually find that it's an upside not to send your email from the same place as does your web hosting. I'll use Creative Mail as an example. So if we do, let me add a new plugin. There we go. Let's use Creative Mail. So if I want to do email marketing, I could use cPanel for that. But what Creative Mail does is it uses Constant Contact, which is a lot like MailChimp for that. And then your web server doesn't really have to do any of the work when it comes to actually sending that email, which means that all of the complicated setup and all of the troubleshooting and worrying about spam and all of those things, that becomes Creative Mail's problem or MailChimp's problem or whoever your email provider is. Amazon SES, that becomes their problem, and not nearly as much a concern of cPanel or your web host or you that you have to figure out. So sometimes it is a little better to do it that way. And some people, so Creative Mail is a good one that I really like. Another one is MailChimp. It's really popular. MailChimp, depending on your budget, might even be better because it has a free tier that that lets you, depending on how many emails you need to send, will let you use it for free. And this is just for marketing emails. Like this isn't going to be what you use for like a like password resets and things like that. But if you've, if you're going to be sending quite a bit of marketing emails and you're using WordPress as kind of the hub of where you manage that, it's probably a good idea to figure out how you can set that up such that WordPress isn't what's sending all the emails. And you'll have a lot less problems with spam and, hey, some of my emails aren't arriving or they're late or whatever that is.
What do you know about resource loading and email? In other words, if I'm using cPanel for email, is that counted against, is any resource demand there counted against my account load?
Yes.
Yeah, I would think it would be, yeah.
The longer answer is yes, but not how you might expect. The sending and receiving emails, if it's not very many emails, sending and receiving isn't actually that resource intensive. Where you'll probably run into problems first is the disk usage before you ever hit a performance problem.
Okay.
But what
Yeah,
does
right.
sometimes create a resource issue is the mechanism used to access that, which is depending on your hosting provider, they may have limits on the number of concurrent IMAP or POP3 connections. And depending on your client and how many people are connecting, it might you might find that, like for example, I think it was either Outlook or Thunderbird. One of those had a setting that would allow you to create a new connection for every folder in your email.
Wow.
And which is great for the client because that means, oh, you can pull stuff down faster. But it's terrible for the server because that means one person is creating, dozens of open connections with that server. And that actually, because of the network usage, does significantly impact the performance of your site potentially.
Yeah.
So yes, it can use it, but probably not sending and receiving emails. That's probably not going to use a ton because that's, depending on what MTA they're using, it's probably not hugely resource intensive, but it depends on the setup. It might be. Where it's far more common, I would say, in my experience, and I've worked with more than just Bluehost before, but in my experience, it's far more common for the mechanism used to access that email to create a performance issue, or the file system on the disk growing to an extent that it creates a performance issue.
Sure. Great. Thank you.
I'm going to interrupt you, Chris, because we are starting to wind down in the last half hour, and I do want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to talk about the benefits of hosting with Bluehost. So if you or Devin want to kind of jump in, I'm going to share what I found on your website, which is the hosting link. So if you want to click through to that, if you want to talk a little bit about the difference between your different hosting plans, I think you do have managed hosting as well as shared hosting and all that. So I'm going to let you kind of talk about that for a few minutes.
Sure. And, and I don't need to spend a ton of time on this, but like Bluehost is a really good option, but there's also a lot of really other good options out there. Really what you want to look for in a hosting provider is two things. One, that they're good at what you're trying to do. So if what you're trying to do is WordPress, you're going to want to find somebody that's good at that. And Bluehost is really good at WordPress. There's other companies that also are. WordPress.org/hosting is one place that you can find hosting providers that are very hosting centric, but there's also a lot of other really good ones out there. But yeah, are they good at what you're trying to do? And are they in your price point? Are the two things that I would look at. There's obviously a lot more, but depending on what you're trying to do, you might find that if you're just getting started, probably something really cheap is what you need. And if you're looking for cheap, good WordPress hosting, you're not going to find something probably that's more for the price better than Bluehost, in my opinion, unless you have very specific needs. But it really depends on where you're at. Some people need a little bit more. And, you might be able to, spend $40, $50, $100 a month on your hosting because you get, millions of visitors. Or, you might have a site where, hey, I don't get a million visitors or whatever, but this is an extremely mission critical site with a lot of funding and money behind it. And I need, absolute assurance that this is good. You're going to want something a little bit more managed where where a lot more of the responsibility of your website being up is put on your hosting provider and less so on you. Everyone does manage hosting differently. So some people, some hosting providers, like for example, WordPress.com, manage everything to the point where it would be extraordinarily difficult for you to break a site hosted on WordPress.com. The drawbacks of that are it's very limited in what you can do, and that's on purpose. Those limitations make it so that, hey, you can't break it. You can, whatever you can figure out of how to do, it's great. There's others that take a different approach of, okay, we're going to manage the server, we're going to manage WordPress core, and we're going to alert you if anything goes wrong with a plugin. And there's everything in between. So whether you're managing a site where you need something really cheap, where $295 a month is kind of what you're looking for, or whether you need something that is a little bit more mission critical and you have the money to spend on far more powerful managed solutions that will make it so that Bluehost or your hosting provider has more of a responsibility, there are upmarket options. Or if you need something, outside of even perhaps what we can do, there's other companies like Pagely or WordPress.com VAP, where if you need to host literally the New York Times on WordPress, then there are options everywhere in between that offer different levels of management. So where Bluehost really succeeds is Bluehost definitely knows what we're doing when it comes to WordPress, and Bluehost does a really good job at making it very, very cost effective. So what we're able to provide for $20 a month, for $5 a month, is performance that you'll probably find equivalent for using a VPS from a more traditional host. So if you just get a really traditional stock cPanel host that gives you a VPS for $30 to $50, you'll probably get that or better performance out of a very, very cheap hosting plan from Bluehost, because we're focused very, very specifically on WordPress.
What's a VPS?
a virtual private server. It's a way of
Oh, yeah,
setting up.
okay. Right.
Yeah, it's a way of setting up a server so that it acts like you have the whole server to yourself, even though you really don't.
Right, yeah.
One of the things that I never recommend is just going based on price, because you can find some dirt cheap hosting that
Right.
really will not serve you well. You can't access people. You have no idea who you're talking to ever. Like getting somebody to answer, tickets and things like that might be difficult. Finding somebody that's cost effective, but that you can trust the team is super important. So check out their Twitter account. If you go to Twitter and you look up the Bluehost Twitter account, they're tweeting all day, every day, fun things, interesting things, super supportive things. They're engaging with the community in a way. If you go to a WordCamp and they have a table there, they're real people that you can talk to. I can wave across at Chris when I'm sitting at the give table, things like that. So, if all things are equal, then I think it's the people that also make a difference. And so, ask around, find out who can vouch for the people behind the product as well.
Yeah,
So Chris,
all of that, really good point.
Chris, where's your tech support? Is it U.S. based or India based or Philippines or what?
I just wanted to, while you're doing that, I just wanted to test out how long it would take if I chatted in. So I just started to chat. Let's see how long they take. This one answered in 33 seconds. That's not bad.
Not bad.
Yeah, I'll give them a good score. We've got support centers all over the world. We've got a really, really big one in Tempe, Arizona. And I go and visit that sometimes because my sister happens to live in Mesa, Arizona. So sometimes I go and visit my sister and Bluehost pays for it. When I work out of that office. I work primarily out of Utah. We don't have any support centers here. We also have a support center in Mangalore, India. We have one in Manila, Philippines. We have right now that's most of what we have, and a majority, particularly for Bluehost, majority of the tech support happens right now in the Tempe location. But we are looking at expanding to more locations as well. But yeah, right now we have locations all over the world, and all of them are staffed around the clock.
Nice. Any last questions for Chris before we let him go for the evening? I want to say thank you so much. I know Devin's probably still lurking around here somewhere too with his poor allergies. Thank you so much for I called on you guys kind of last minute at the end of December, and you were both like, yeah, we're in, we'll help you out. We're going to be here for you guys. And I really, really appreciate you stepping in and being here for our little meetup tonight. Yeah. Any other questions, anybody? Any WordPress, non-hosting questions or cPanel questions? Chris and Devin probably know the answers to that too. Yeah, Jim.
I just wanted to say thank you. It was just the explanation on DNS was very helpful tonight for us non-technical people. So it was very good. I appreciate your time and the presentation.
Thanks.
Very cool.
Where's your shirt from?
This one is, most of my t-shirts are from WordCamps. This one looks like WordCamp Boston 2017. So that's when I was there.
I was there in 2018.
Me too.
That's right. Jim and I both spoke that one. Very
Let's see.
cool.
Was that a year that I spoke? WordCamp Boston, Chris David Miles. I do not think I spoke that year at Boston. I was an attendee though.
There you go. Me too. Steve, I just saw you unmute yourself. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do actually have a question, Chris. First, I want to say thank you. I started going through the website that I'm supporting, and I did notice some things that need to change. One is that the mail server URL is still defaulted to mailexample.com, and it still sends out. I still am getting the messages, so I don't know how that works. Apparently, there's a default, for example, that goes magically to whatever your
Interesting.
SMTP is set to. So I guess I have to change that now.
That if I had to guess, I would say that it's failing SMTP and falling back to
Hmm.
PHP mail. And PHP mail is probably set by whoever your host is to some default config that works.
Okay.
If I had to guess, I'd say that's why it's working even with bad settings.
But fix that.
I might want to fix that. Yeah.
But
So
yeah,
thank you.
definitely
That's
fix
actually
it.
very helpful. Only been 2-3 years.
Did you also have a question, Steve, or just?
No, that's it. That's my
Okay, very good.
question. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead and fix that. Anybody else? I do want to remind you all that WordFest is coming up January 22nd. It is a 24-hour WordPress event. And I am very deeply involved in that. And the tickets are free. And you're welcome to leave a $10 donation when you do sign up, which helps support Big Orange Heart, because we are a charity for remote workers and rooted in the WordPress community specifically. So you know that
So
$10 can certainly help.
what is this thing again?
Wordfest.live. It's a 24-hour WordPress event. It's like a WordCamp, but it's not WordCamp because we are not part of WordPress.org. But it is a 24-hour online WordPress festival celebration, and we have 49 speakers lined up right now, and we got some pretty awesome talks coming up. Everything from yoga to how to deal with forms on your websites to everything in between. So
What's the date?
January 22nd, and it's 24-hour clock, so it actually starts at I think it's 11 UTC, 11 p.m. UTC on the 21st, and goes through a 24-hour clock. So
I was gonna say, Chris and I will be there as well, representing Bluehost.
yay, that's awesome. I forgot you guys are sponsoring, right?
I believe we're in the final stages of getting that all squared away, but yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you in advance for that. Then appreciate that you're all doing that. So
We are only doing it on the North American section because how the sponsorship is tiered. So if you tune in within the 24 hours and you're looking for us, we won't be there all day.
But you'll have a table. We're called tables. You'll have your own room, private room for people to be able to talk to you and for you to chat with people too. So that'll be pretty awesome.
So,
Devin will be in charge of the stream in the middle of the night. I'll be there at 5. I'm just kidding.
So Chris, earlier in your talk, you talked about the DNS phone book concept. Yeah. So if you point to the DNS servers of your where you're hosting from your domain server, do you still need the A record as well, or is that kind of redundant?
Well, usually no. And the reason for that is that the A record is part of your zone file, and the zone file is inside that phone book. It's managed by whoever the name server authority is for that domain. So I could have a DNS server, here on my desk, but it wouldn't matter if no one had written down anywhere that it was authoritative for the domain name, right? Okay. So the only one that matters is the one that's authoritative. Now, where you might find you need more than one is if you ever move it. So if you're changing name servers from one set of name servers to another set of name servers, it's a good idea to have records in both places because some people will be still looking in the old location.
Okay.
And if that's the case, it's a good idea to have them in both. But most of the time, no, you're right. It would be redundant just because if you're and most of the time they won't let a good registrar probably wouldn't let you set an A record and custom name servers. They would tell you, oh, hey, you have custom name servers, so nothing you put in here matters. But yeah.
I think I must have set them first and then set the name servers because for some reason it's still sitting there. See, okay. I'm finding out lots of new things. Okay.
Yeah. What's the domain name, if you don't mind me asking?
HenriettaUCC.org.
HenriettaUCC.org. was able to find it for the Google search. So you are currently pointed at the name servers or SiteGround,
Yep.
which means you would log into your SiteGround account to change the A record.
Okay, so the one
And if the
sitting on
website is hosted with SiteGround, you probably don't need to mess with the A record at all because SiteGround can keep track of it for you.
right, but the domains are at Hover.
Right. So in your Hover account, you
There's an
have
A
it set
record in
to
there
use
that's ignored.
SiteGround's phone book, right?
Right.
And so if you also have an A record in Hover, that probably isn't being used because the name servers are set to SiteGround.
Okay, that makes more sense now.
Cool.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm just thinking about the conversation you and Steve just had, and wondering if there might be an easy way to determine how things work. What's the path? Like, is the A record used or not? How can I? In other words, good housekeeping is what I'm thinking about here. Is if the A record is used, good. Now I know that. I see by looking at what at something, and another way of looking at it is I'm not seeing my A record or my C record or C name rather listed here. Therefore, I can assume that they're not being used. Is there anything
Probably,
to that
yeah.
line of thinking?
But it doesn't hurt to double check. But yeah, if you can get to your website in a browser, and it loads correctly, then you're probably set up in a way that's just fine.
Understood.
But yeah, what you'll want to double check is wherever you bought the domain, look at what the settings are for the name servers. If you're and make sure that's right. And if that's right, and you can load it into a browser, almost certainly everything's set up correctly.
The reason I'm asking is because I have my domains all or all but one at Google, domains.google.com, and I'm pretty sure that for at least one site I have both C names and A records.
Right. So sometimes what Google likes to do, because with Google domains, they have and I know this because I've worked with them, particularly their domains team. They have a particular preference toward people using Google's DNS. So even when it isn't necessarily the easiest way for their customer to set it up this way, they prefer people use Google's phone book, as it were. So they'll really go out of their way to make sure that manually setting the IP address is the easiest thing to do. So it wouldn't surprise me if, yeah, that's the way that it's set up. And as long as it works in your browser,
Yeah.
and nobody's telling you that it doesn't load for them, it's probably just fine.
Well, but then again, Google goes around and changes things every now and then, fixes or improves things, and then things that did work don't anymore.
Yeah. So that's a possibility as well.
Now, the way I have it set up, it's currently set up with the MX records at the domain server and the C record at the domain server. So does that make sense, or should that also be going to the web host?
Who is hosting your email? Who's
Google Apps.
What's the domain name again?
HenriettaUCC.org.
Okay. If it's supposed to be Google Apps, it's pointed at Google Apps. So you're good there.
So basically the domain name is being used as kind of a master location, and then it points to the hosting for the name server dealing with the website, and then the mail it's being pointed to Google. Does that
Yeah, here's I'll show you. So your A record, which is the record for a IP address that is formatted this way,
Yep.
is pointed at this IP address, which if I, in my other window, look it up, appears to be a Google IP. So this is, it appears offhand as though your website is hosted with Google. Are you using a Google service for your website?
No, I'm using SiteGround. But the mail is being done through Google Sites or Google Suite, whatever Google has.
Oh, I know why. You're on probably one of their new managed WordPress instances that uses GCP. So SiteGround is using Google's data center.
Oh, okay.
Bluehost does that in a few places too. Sometimes if we want to move into a region quickly, we'll ask Google for a portion of their data centers because it's faster than building our own. So yeah, so it looks like you're set up correctly, because when I look up your mail exchange records, that's all pointed at Google Apps correctly.
Right.
And when I look at, well, hey, where's the A record, that is pointed at what appears to be a Google IP. But yeah, you're still, SiteGround is still managing the server. Google is plugging it into power.
I seem to recall you saying at the beginning of this presentation, it's simple.
Well, it can be.
I don't remember if I said that, but that doesn't sound right. Not simple at all.
I might be stretching it a bit.
Yeah. I tried to simplify it into just phone books and phone numbers, but it's not simple at all.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much.
All right, so we're just about to wrap up. I do want to again say thank you guys. I really appreciate, Chris and Devin for being here. I also want to announce next month's meetup is going to be on accessibility, and Trevor and Marianne are going to lead the pack that week and that day and talk to us a little bit about making your sites more accessible. And then I'm putting together the schedule of some ideas for the rest of the year, and I'm curious. I realize we have a very small sample size right now. But I'm curious if people are interested in a demonstration on how to set up a membership site, because I have access to some people who have membership plugins who would be interested in coming to talk to us if we do. So I was thinking about setting that up for March. And then
Yes.
Okay, cool. We'll do that for March then if I can get them in. And Trevor has another topic for a little bit later in the year, maybe April or May, depending on how things all shake together. So keep sending me ideas, and I will keep reaching out to people who are outside of our group and can teach us things that we don't have internally, and also continue to pull from within the group as well for those things that we can teach each other. So thank you so much, Chris, Devin. Thanks for giving up your dinner time for us. Appreciate it so much. And I'll see you guys.
Thank you very much.
Everybody else,
Yep,
I'll see on either Facebook or Slack.
And actually, guys, I'm sorry, I didn't say this earlier, but Bluehost was one of our sponsors for WordPress or WordCamp Rochester. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
They're good people over there. And once a month they do a Twitter chat, and their Twitter chat is always fun, and they always invite me to be a part of it, which makes me feel special. So there you go. That's always fun too. So pay attention to their Twitter account. It's a lot of fun. They ask a lot of good questions. This morning they asked a question right as Slack went down, and that was my first answer. They're like, what are you looking forward to this year? I'm like, Slack being back up. So that was a fun day. I'm going to stop the recording now too, because I always forget.